Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you all for joining today's webcast. We're going to be talking about what your open source software playbook for 2016 should be all about. A little bit different from sort of your standard enterprise software webcast. Here we're not really going to be focusing and pitching technology, but we're really trying to help arm you with some ideas that you can use to go back into your organization and take your participation in open source to the next level. And so we know there's a number of different challenges, not just about technology, but really around people and process that's part of that. A couple housekeeping items before we get started. This is being recorded and we will have a replay available. We'll also be sharing our slides on SlideShare, which I think could prove useful. And then lastly is to go ahead and put your questions in the chat box. We'll have some time at the end to answer some of those questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel we have here. In order to help with this interesting topic, we've got Stephen O'Grady, Principal Analyst and Co-founder at RedMonk, and we have Roman Shaposhnik, Director of Open Source here at Pivotal. I'm Doreen Drewitz, Director of Product Marketing for the Pivotal Big Data Suite. So with that, I'm going to dive into quickly just an overview of the agenda and what we hope to achieve at the end of this 1-hour session. So first, we're going to be talking a little bit about why open source. And there's a lot of background here that will prove useful, certainly with the times when you might have to engage other folks in your organization to make the case for open source. And then we want to shift into talking about some best practices. And then lastly, focus on where to start, and this is really where we want to leave you with an actionable list, a playbook, if you will, for how to take on open source in 2016. So first up is why open source. And this is where I'm going to ask the panelists to chime in here, but the notion of software is eating the world is something that has certainly been talked about for a number of years. The Mark Andreessen editorial written a number of years ago, and it's really been playing out with the likes of Google, Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, Netflix, and a whole host of other companies that are really in the business of taking software and creating new experiences for their customers. So, Stephen, perhaps you could chime in a little bit and talk about how does open source fit in with this entire movement of software eating the world?
Of course. Yeah, thank you very much, Doreen. So the net from my perspective is open source, for a majority of organizations, certainly in the web world today, increasingly across a wide variety of businesses, is the foundation, upon which they're built. And that doesn't mean, of course, that all the software that they either consume and or produce themselves, is going to be open source software releases open source software, but increasingly it is the foundation. Whether we're talking operating systems, database technologies, containers, virtualization layers, and so on, increasingly is sort of built upon a foundation of open source software, and that's no surprise, right, to folks who know the history of organizations, on here, Google, Facebook, certainly Netflix has been very outspoken in terms of the usage and promotion, indeed, of open source. The interesting thing from my perspective, however, has been to note, the degree to which, these organizations have not just consumed and sort of built themselves upon open source, but increasingly released their own software as open source itself. The conclusion that many of them are coming to is that the benefits of producing the software and either keeping it proprietary, keeping it sort of protected within their organization versus releasing it as open source, the cost-benefit ratio increasingly for them is tilting in favor of the latter. Increasingly is tilting in favor of releasing, their software as open source. So it's no surprise, that, as software is eating the world, that open source is, essentially a major driver and contributor to that trend.
So when you mentioned that it's tipping towards, the cost benefit is tipping towards, being more beneficial to open source software themselves. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit further on that.
Yeah, of course. So, basically the notion for years, the funny thing is that, I talk a lot about the history of software and the history of open source. And, if we go back to the actual roots of the commercial software market itself, they are something that looks very much like open source. In other words, the first hardware platforms, the mainframe platforms, as an example, all the software that came with that essentially was released as open source because the software was not necessarily the ends, rather it was the means, to sell software. Over time, however, it became sort of more standard, to keep software proprietary, to keep it protected, to keep it to attempt to preserve it as a competitive advantage. And what we've seen certainly in the last, I would say 4 to 5 years, is that a lot of the organizations are sort of taking a hard look at this and saying, look, is this a competitive advantage for me, a legitimate competitive advantage, or am I going to get more benefits out of, sort of releasing these assets as open source software? And we'll get into certainly what some of those benefits are. But one of the sort of basics was the papers that resulted in Hadoop. Google published these a number of years ago. They did not release their implementation of MapReduce as open source, notably, although that's changed, certainly in sort of recent months. But really what we've seen, is Google looking at this and saying, we're going to get more benefit out of, disclosing this new approach, this new MapReduce approach, than we would if we kept it proprietary. And, organizations have asked us, well, why is that? And it's not difficult if you think about it. If you're recruiting, if you're Google, and the first time that anybody has seen or heard of MapReduce is the first day they start with their organization, it's going to take them a lot longer, new recruits rather, it's going to take them a lot longer to get ramped up. If, on the other hand, you've released details of this and they can familiarize themselves with the technology and the approach and so on, your hiring job becomes a lot easier. And that's just one example, and as I said, we'll go through more of them.
Yeah. Now, Roman, I think you had a comment you wanted to jump in there with.
Yeah, I actually wanted to pile on top of what Stephen was saying. And I think, one interesting fact to note is that if you look at all of these companies that everybody is trying to emulate these days, some of them even may look like traditional enterprises, let's say, Uber and, Airbnb and Netflix. But all of them share this commonality that at the core, they end up being software businesses. So I think, not even just how the software business is, changing, but also how the core traditional enterprises are changing is very, very interesting. Basically, all of these businesses are becoming software businesses. The software defines the business value. The software defines, the sort of core of the business. And I think it's interesting to know that once you sort of become a software business, being an open source software business almost becomes an inevitable next step because there's just so much more leverage you can get from utilizing open source software as opposed to just, being a consumer of a traditional enterprise package software.
Yeah, and that kind of brings up another interesting point here, which is that, as you stated, these companies, not even just your traditional internet-based companies, but all kinds of enterprises, are evolving into software businesses. And even when we say it's a software business, you touched on it exactly, where it's a core competency, because none of these guys are in the business of selling software. So we have to kind of separate in our minds a little bit. What it means to be a software business isn't necessarily mean you're, a software company like an Oracle or a Microsoft anymore. And this, Stephen, I know this kind of goes right at the crux of your software paradox thesis, if you wanted to comment a little bit on that.
Sure. Yeah. Essentially, the notion is that sort of as we discussed briefly, in the early days, software was released, sort of as a not an afterthought, but certainly as an enabler, as opposed to something to be sold. That changed for a number of years. Particularly with the rise of Microsoft. Microsoft identified and capitalized on the opportunity of selling software and rode that to at the time unprecedented heights, from a valuation standpoint. But really, what we've seen, certainly recently, as you point out, is that we had businesses sort of large and small in virtually every industry, every vertical that we could talk about that are being dramatically impacted by software. And a lot of the organizations who are in these businesses are looking at this and saying, look, I have to produce software because I have to solve some unique problem, but I'm going to get sort of more out of my investments in this software. If I am essentially collaborating and, working with other organizations, because my competitive differentiation, isn't necessarily, if I'm, just to use this list, if I'm, Google, if I'm a search engine, if I'm a social network, if I'm a transport company, housing company, sort of online movie, streaming and distribution. Those are the businesses that I'm in. I'm not in the business of selling software. And so not surprisingly, a lot of those organizations have, essentially looked at this and said, we're going to get more benefit if we, work with each other than we are if we try to maintain this ourselves. And, what that means is that we've seen a tremendous influx of new technology, great, impressive new technologies that years ago, would have been sort of, produced for sale and sold for, millions and millions of dollars, on a per unit basis. And they're available for free. And they're available for free, because these organizations have looked at this and said, hey, if I'm Facebook and I have I produced a database like Cassandra, I can release that and collaborate with other organizations, and it doesn't improve my business to keep that closed. So yeah, the software paradox has been interesting to observe in terms of the shift away from software strictly for purposes of sale to monetizing software through other mechanisms and enabling other businesses.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to sort of look a little more closely at an example here. Netflix being one where they've, this is coming straight from Adrian Cockcroft from a couple of years ago, when he was still with Netflix, and he very publicly articulates, and this is available on one of his slide shares, what Netflix did to get ahead, and I've circled around open source software being one of those, but that being kind of, exactly that point about getting more of the collaboration versus where your actual competitive advantage is. Now maybe we can kind of turn this on its head and talk about how using open source actually becomes potentially part of that competitive advantage, in terms of going right to those, what are those benefits that you get from using open source that actually spur your business forward faster? And either Roman or Stephen, please jump in on that.
I think, I actually have a very quick comment on that, because, whenever I talk to people and, they tell me, well, how shall we use open source software, I actually get surprised at that question because, to me, the consumption of open source software is no different, sort of on the consumption side than anything else that you've done in the past, right? You still use products, essentially, that, being supported either by the community or a vendor that, you selected. It's just that you're getting additional, quite significant leverage over where that software product is going, and you can actually move that software product in the direction that is beneficial to your business, thus sort of enabling you innovate, on a business via software play, right? It's just all these additional leverage points that you're getting from the open source software that I think makes it so interesting. The consumption fact itself doesn't really change much.
Indeed. And Stephen, maybe there was something else when we talked about this before, in terms of recruiting, that you had an interesting comment about what this meant in terms of, Netflix's ability to then build all the great software that they've built.
Yeah, indeed. So certainly organizations that have embraced open source. And again, I do need to stress that embracing open source is not a binary switch. It's not everything is open or everything is closed. Even the organizations that we're talking about that have, sort of dramatically embraced open source do keep, some things proprietary and some things closed because they do represent a competitive advantage. But for those organizations that have embraced it, one of the things that, they frequently cite as one of the primary justifications is the benefits to recruitment, retention, and so on. In other words, it's much easier to recruit new developers if they know ahead of time that they're going to have the opportunity to work on projects in public, to work on interesting technologies, to continue to collaborate, with cross-industry, sort of groups of like-minded developers, and it also helps retain them. In other words, if you are an organization that is increasingly competing with other organizations that are allowing their developers to work on open source, it's much more difficult, to retain them. And it's interesting, as Romain mentioned, we had a conversation ahead of this particular call, and Adrian Cockcroft, who, as mentioned, was at Netflix, it used to be asked the question when he was there in terms of, hey, where do you find, these elite developers that are working on open source and building all the technologies that Netflix has become famous for? And he'd get this question sort of repeatedly from Fortune 50 and Fortune 500 and so on CIOs. And his answer was pretty simple. His answer was, we hired them from you. And, the point that he's making there, I think, is a very, very important one, which is because Netflix allows their developers a lot of freedom and the ability to work on and contribute to important open source projects, they're able to, again, sort of attract and retain very, very elite talent. And elite talent that, was otherwise working at organizations that, were doing interesting work, these Fortune 50, Fortune 500 organizations, but trying to keep their developers, sort of strictly working in the dark. So certainly it's a big advantage. It's a big edge in terms of recruitment and retention.
Yeah, and actually that's something that Roman and I have talked about. Something I've noticed is, you look at a lot of these, software-based companies in the software economy, and whether it's, LinkedIn, Twitter, Netflix, etc., and you can find web pages on their sites that are dedicated to which projects they have open source, so they can be very public about it. And, when I first showed this to Roman, his reaction was like, these are just recruiting pages. And it's true. They all talk about, if you read any of the blog posts where they're going into detail about how they're architecting this or that, it always ends with this invitation to, hey, if this is interesting to you, come join the team. And I feel like this is another interesting data point that came from a Black Duck Software survey this year. They do these surveys every year. And they found that the percentage of organizations saying that they will start to release those internal tools and projects increased dramatically from 18% just last, 2 years ago in 2014 to 47% in 2015. So almost half the companies out there now have on their radar that they want to open source, which, to your point, they're not open sourcing necessarily something that's truly a competitive advantage to them, but something that, they're going to get more benefit out of open sourcing it than they would by keeping it internal. So, we've kind of talked already about both the value of recruiting and retaining top developer talent by using open source and being very open and public about it. But I think this survey result really showing an uptick in an appetite and a realization. I think that really stood out to me. If either of you guys want to comment on that before we move on.
I just have a quick observation that, to me, interestingly enough, a lot of times, at least part of the reason that gets cited why, companies keep sort of increasing the number of projects that they put into the open is, very similar to what's happening in the scientific community. It's essentially a sort of peer review, right? You're basically putting your work out in the open, for others to critique and contribute to. And the bigger that community that, you can involve in sort of caring about the results of your work, the better the work becomes. So that's just an interesting parallel between, how software world functions and how scientific community world functions.
Yeah, and I think that the notable piece from this particular side for me is essentially the increase, right? Which is, according to this particular survey, you're talking, almost half, of organizations say they're going to release internal tools and projects open source. And one of the things that, we try to remind organizations is that, these surveys tend to be lagging indicators. So many of you, for example, may have been asked the question organizationally, are we using cloud? What is our sort of embrace of cloud technologies? And, very frequently, one of the things that you'll hear from, essentially decision makers and CIOs and, sort of IT leaders within these organizations is, we're planning on it. We're not sort of there yet. When the actual reality on the ground, within these organizations is that cloud is used quite extensively. And, it's very much the same situation with open source. Frequently what we sort of encounter is that the sort of organizational awareness of actually how much open source is A, being used, and B, in some cases being contributed, is lagging. So this 1 in 2 number is impressive by itself, but my suspicion is that, I think if you actually went out and sort of, looked at and talked to every member of the organization, that number is actually even higher than Black Duck indicates it is.
Yeah, and I think a key takeaway there in terms of if this number is even lagging, then if you don't have this on your radar, then you're very quickly going to be in a deeply lagging kind of group in terms of, this is no longer just an exercise that very bleeding edge companies go through to open source their own internal development. This is now becoming a mainstream practice. So let's talk about overcoming some of those challenges. I think we've spent a good amount of time talking about why. There's just one last kind of point I want to talk about here and kind of to illustrate this is to highlight how this is really moving beyond just traditional internet-based startups, what have you. Is a little bit of a quiz for the audience, but really it's to guess what company that's not a Silicon Valley company that in July of last year announced the release of a DevOps dashboard to the open source community that they had built, and a couple months later hired I'm probably going to butcher the name, Jim Jiglieski, the co-founder of the Apache Software Foundation, as their senior director of their fellows program. So we can sort of cue the Jeopardy music here as everyone thinks and puts in their answer. And prize, Capital One. So not necessarily the type of organization and enterprise that you would associate with those types of behaviors, but this is becoming mainstream, I think, is the key takeaway here. So just to recap a little bit of some of the points we talked about in terms of why open sourcing. We talked about recruiting. We talked about retention. By the way, did we mention talent? Just want to really reiterate that's a really important point. We touched a little bit on roadmap, transparency, and ownership. And Roman in particular, I know you called out leverage and this being a really important point as you transition to becoming your own software company, and that being a core competency in your business. This is a great leverage point. And then finally is speed, just the speed at which the software can improve. I think the peer review example you gave, Roman, in terms of how this allows software to become better faster because it's being looked at by a wider group. Before we move on to the best practices, I just want to drill in a little bit because, of course, I'm kind of coming from the data management side, and so just a quick word on open source for data management, just to get your thoughts, Steve and Roman, about why open source is particularly important in the data management part of your infrastructure.
Well, I'll take a quick stab at that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Roman.
No, go ahead, Stephen.
So, I mean, in other words, I think that the net for me is pretty simple, in the sense that, the history of the technology industry in sort of category by category by category, platform by platform by platform, is characterized by lock-in, right? So we've had that from operating systems to virtualization platforms and sort of on and on and on. And it's particularly been true of databases. In some sense, we've tried to have sort of standard mechanisms, SQL being the most obvious in terms of sort of accessing and leveraging data. But, the organizations have done everything they can, the vendors, that is, have done everything they can to essentially retain their customers. And, that means lock-in. And, the really interesting thing about, open source, apart from all the benefits that we've talked about in terms of recruitment, retention, availability, and cost, and, sort of all those things, is frankly the ability to avoid lock-in, right? So in other words, if you're going with an open source platform that, may be supported by multiple commercial players, it may have, obviously sort of local options that you can sort of download, run, yourself. You may have publicly managed alternatives. It basically just gives you more options in terms of not being beholden and not being sort of locked into a single supplier, and that is profoundly transformative because it's one thing to be sort of tied to sort of an operating system, a virtualization layer, or what have you, but it is an entirely different thing altogether to have your data, the most important part of your application, be locked to a supplier. And it's funny, every year, the commercial database vendors will up their prices, and, reporters will come to us and say, hey, is this the year that everybody leaves this database platform? And the answer, of course, is no, because when you're locked into a platform, the costs, and risks of moving off that platform are immense. So avoiding lock-in via open source is a tremendous, tremendous opportunity.
Absolutely, and I absolutely agree with that. I mean, to me, sort of in a data center, the data management, the bits are the stickiest piece. You can replace a lot of things, but replacing storage platforms is probably the costliest exercise. And if you can be guaranteed that you are not actually going sort of to be a hostage of a particular vendor by essentially leveraging open source software, then you can, be rest assured that your bits sort of will always be available to you because, in the worst possible case scenario, you can at least, self-support, which may not necessarily be the case with some of the database vendors, as we've seen, databases sort of going, from going out of business and, file system companies going out of business. And again, like I said, I think the stickiest bit in the data center is sort of bits, is the management of data.
Yeah, so it's this is something to definitely keep on the radar in terms of where you're spending your efforts of prioritizing your open source participation. So with that, let's dive into a couple of best practices, because I think we've set the stage now in terms of there's a lot of reasons to embrace open source and participate more deeply in it, not just on a purely consumption level, which Roman, as you kind of explained really nicely, is actually not that different from pretty much any other software model. It really starts to get different when you kind of transition away from purely being a open source consumer to beginning to have a deeper engagement level and participating directly with those projects. So I think the first and arguably most important point that we've talked about leading up to this call around best practices is cultural transformation. So it's really got almost nothing to do with the technology itself. It's really people and process. So Roman, maybe you can help me unpack this a little bit in terms of, what does it mean to take on cultural transformation in terms of increasing your open source participation?
Absolutely. So let me try to take a stab at this. So I think it begins with understanding that pretty soon all of the businesses will become software businesses. And that's actually, even regardless of the open source component of this is a huge cultural transformation. I mean, at Pivotal, we help our customers, going through this transformation. We call it a digital transformation, sort of enterprises becoming digital enterprises. This is the highest sort of order bit, for the company's leadership, to realize that from now on, software will define their business competency and their business advantage. So that's sort of the highest order bit. And then from that, I think it is very natural that from that the open source component flows, because once you really define yourself as a software business, you need to be able to leverage as big as the pool of software as possible, and that sort of becomes your first foray into embracing open source software on the consumption side. But you also, at some point, will very quickly realize that you cannot really be passive in just that, act of consumption. You actually have to contribute to that software, not because of some altruistic reason, but because your business requirements will be changing every day. And as they do, your software platforms will have to follow. Because, again, remember, we redefined our business as a software, as a digital business from now on. And once that happens, you actually would have to figure out how do you participate in the open source communities in the most meaningful way. And that's sort of the final bit of the cultural transformation. A lot of times it's the toughest bit to go through because, a lot of the teams that are working for, traditional enterprises, for example, they're absolutely ecstatic about, bringing the open source software into the enterprise, right? But open sourcing some of the core tech that they've been working on becomes a little bit of a challenge for them because, there's just a lot of kind of like implicit assumptions of what is going to happen, and sort of not really sort of that much of an understanding of how to build communities around the technology that exists within the enterprise. So that has to be helped with. But if there is somebody who is very carefully moving the enterprise into this direction, I think this can be a very successful transformation for an enterprise.
What are some things, practically speaking, that companies can start with when they're sort of, maybe they've gotten that leadership buy-in, that top-down recognition that, hey, you're going to be a software company, software's going to define your business, and it's now has to flow through the rest of the organization. What are some just practical, tactical things that companies can do to start to move in that direction? You talked about peer review and sort of the scientific community as an example. Is there anything we can kind of learn from that even within an organization before directly engaging with the open source community?
What I try to recommend sort of the customers I talk to is to basically start practicing open source, way of life, at least within the enterprise itself. And again, this almost sounds, ridiculous because, within the enterprise, you don't actually have to hide code from, one team, one team doesn't have to hide it from the other, right? But you would be surprised, right? There is a lot of silos and barriers that exist within the enterprise that prevents from code sort of contribution and code sharing even between the teams within the same enterprise. So my first suggestion to, most of the customers I talk to who are not really experienced with open source participation yet is to break at least, start breaking those internal barriers, Doing that doesn't require any kind of, legal process, and we'll talk about process a little bit later. It doesn't require any sort of significant, shift on the part of the management team. It's just a very useful exposure into how you will be behaving sort of in a much larger community. But you can start that process within the enterprise itself.
That's a great idea. Stephen, did you have any other sort of ideas and suggestions around how cultural transformation can play out for an organization?
Yeah, cultural transformation, obviously is a process, right? It's a journey as opposed to an end. You're never sort of there. But probably the most important, the most important decision, the most important thing that organizations can do to speed this along is by tasking somebody with it. So in other words, rather than just sort of letting this sort of permeate and percolate organizationally speaking, one of the things that really helps, sort of over and over and over again, we see this, is, essentially the creation of, essentially a center of competency, a center of excellence, sort of call it what you will, but staffed by, people who, this may or may not be their only job. Of course, that depends on organization size and need. But having somebody specifically tasked with being responsible for open source in terms of both consumption, what are we consuming, what is our sort of overall strategy, how does that play out, do we have, for example, restrictions, sort of around licensing and so on, to the other end, which is what do we produce, what do we output as open source, and everything in between in terms of whether we're consuming or producing, how do we engage with communities, what are sort of our processes around that, so basically having sort of some organizational department, basically somebody specifically tasked with overseeing this process can dramatically accelerate that cultural transformation, because then when developers are in an organization and have questions in terms of can I use this, can I release this as open source, if I release it as open source, what license do I choose, sort of and on and on and on, you have somebody organizationally that they can go to, that they can ask these questions of. And as I said, if you're a huge organization, you may have a division, sort of a business, or a department that is basically, this is all they do. In smaller organizations or organizations, that are otherwise strapped, this may be sort of an existing area of IT that just doubles up and says, okay, this is a special area of expertise that we have. But, having somebody specifically on this topic is enormously helpful for speeding this along.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a really important notion there, which was specifically around process. You mentioned tasking someone with it, which is, we kind of joked about if it's not someone's job, then it may not get done. And when we imagine these sort of competency centers, and we sort of talked about the example of Capital One, really, for lack of a better expression, putting their money where their mouth is and bringing someone into their organization who can be that sort of Sherpa. What other functions need to be involved in this process as part of this center of competency?
Well, ideally, I think you have sort of a number of different capabilities, a number of different touch points, right? So for example, it is not necessarily mandated, but it is very important, that whatever an organization's open source strategy is well aligned with leadership, right? So in other words, if you have IT that says one thing about sort of the role of open source, and sort of the executive leadership saying another, that's a problem. So one of the most important things that these centers of competency can do is essentially work with and help formulate consistent organizational strategies, approaches, beliefs, philosophies, and so on about open source, such that if you go and ask any member of an organization at any level, you're going to get, if not the same answer, one that is at least sort of philosophically similar. So that is, those touch points, across leadership are very important. But also, sort of explaining to product teams, right? How this works, why this works, what the benefits are, how this basically plays out organizationally. Can in many cases transcend software. It is not just a software problem. We're increasingly seeing organizations, Facebook is an example here, that are applying open source to sort of previously sort of thought of areas in terms of, in Facebook's case specifically, with the Open Compute project and what they're doing in terms of trying to open source hardware, right? So the sort of the touch points, the influence, if you will, of open source, from an organizational standpoint, ideally transcends the boundaries of software itself. But at a minimum, they need to be, very, very consistent, very, very, well integrated with a wider organization in terms of approach and philosophy.
Yeah, what's interesting about that I'm sort of I'm getting this visual in my head where, a lot of initial open source has been embraced, certainly by developers. And I sort of see this as it can always start there, but at a certain point it needs to sort of flow all the way up to the top and then flow back down somehow. And I think that's a really important point, that you need that leadership buy-in in order to give teeth to that mandate that can actually empower those folks who are really now tasked with and responsible for making this happen, give them that executive mandate. Roman, I don't know if you wanted to comment a little bit more on this one.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight, literally just two areas, which come up the most in my conversations at least. The first one actually has to do with the act of producing the software itself, right? This is the process of kind of software development. And one interesting thing about open source communities is that they're incredibly agile. The software development process is not predicated on sort of one person, understanding every single line of code. It's very distributed. It's very agile. It is very heavily automated in terms of, continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous testing processes. So there's this constant feedback, on any kind of contributions to the community that the community itself can utilize in making decisions of whether to, merge a patch or whether to, make a release or whether to, fix a bug in a particular way. And I think, that is actually different, from at least some of the more traditional enterprise customers and companies that I talk to. They would benefit from that process, but there's not really a forcing function to push them into being that agile. And embracing open source is a good opportunity to basically revisit your software development practices within the organization and say, like, well, look, guys, maybe we actually have to start on this transition, on this journey to becoming more of an agile company. Again, not because it's yet another buzzword that we have to chase, but because if we are truly going into this open source, movement, 100%, then we have to be, because that's the only process that would let us collaborate on the software in the most efficient manner. So that's one. And the second one, and again, I hate to bring this up, but, I have to, it's a legal side, and legal, what I mean by that is has to be very much part of the conversation about licensing, what licensing on the ingress, are permitted, what licensing, you consider when you open source your own pieces of software. Sort of it has to be kept up to date with who is contributing to what, who is, signing what kind of individual contributor licensing agreements. So basically the mechanics of the contribution has to be tracked and visible sort of within the organization, and that's where, legal team gets involved most of the time because, they're typically the guys who say no most of the time. But I think the key to realize is that the way for you to manage them, to make them say yes more than no, is to provide them with tooling that would allow them to have a deep insight into how this collaboration in the open source communities happen. And based on that tooling, it will be much more, appropriate or at least easier for them to say like, oh, seeing what I see, it seems to be okay. I now understand who is contributing to what. I now see, where the contributions flow. You don't have to ask permission for every single patch that goes out because, the tooling allows me to have this, 360-degree view of what's going on between the enterprise and the bigger open source community. So these two.
Okay, yeah, those are two great focus areas. And, just one question I had was in terms of, the act of producing software. You mentioned how this really forces the move towards Agile and practices like continuous integration. Kind of going back to the earlier question about what can folks start doing on their own necessarily before they sort of fully pull back the curtain and engage. Is this something that makes sense for organizations to sort of start implementing when they're still, say, open source behind the firewall, to use the expression you used?
Yeah, absolutely, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. Like I'm saying, my belief is that it is the best way to produce software, and it's sort of the most customer-focused way of producing software. And yeah, you absolutely, if you're an enterprise today, you absolutely should consider bringing it as part of your daily routine. And there's actually, a number of really good companies you can engage with to help that transition. Obviously I work for Pivotal, so Pivotal is a good example of a company that helps organizations transition into a more agile way of developing software. So yeah, that's a great starting point.
So that kind of actually what you just touched on in terms of engaging with third parties as part of this process brings us to our next best practice, which is really around collaboration. And, the way I think of it is, process is sometimes as part of the umbrella of cultural transformation. Process is sometimes around those internal things that have to be taken on. And then collaboration can be around those external practices that you can start to adopt, and these two together are both part of what can drive cultural transformation. So you mentioned working with software vendors, and maybe, Stephen, you can chime in on what the value is around working with software vendors in open source as part of increasing your own participation in open source.
Yeah, of course. So, obviously sort of at its core, open source is about collaboration. That can be within, a single organization. More frequently, it's across a number of organizations. But one of the questions, sort of logically that a lot of organizations new to open source have is, how does this work? What are my responsibilities? What should my expectations be in terms of, how I work with a project? How I contribute to a project, what I'm expected to give back, what does the interaction look like? Then one of the things that we've seen sort of very frequently over the years, even at very, very large organizations, many of the internet organizations that we talked about earlier in this presentation, have been in this position where they've worked with vendors. They've worked with vendors who, basically this is what they do, right? They work to run, maintain, support these commercial open source organizations, and they work in concert with their clients, to not just sort of hey, I'm going to help support this software for you, but I'm also going to sort of help you understand how to engage, help you understand how to contribute, help you understand and educate you on sort of again what the responsibilities, expectations are associated with a given project. So collaboration sort of in any number of directions is going to essentially be vital, to the success of an open source initiative, within organizations of all shapes and sizes.
I think that's a great place to transition into the next and last section of our talk here, which is really around identifying where to start. And figuring out, what's the right entry point into increasing your participation. So the first thing we've sort of observed here is to start with projects close to home, and I've kind of illustrate this with the notion of you got to crawl before you walk, before you run. And so we've talked about projects that you're already using heavily, and that you have already built up some domain expertise around, as being logical places to start for where you should prioritize your next phase of participation. Roman and Steve, I don't know, can you guys comment a little bit about what else is so important about starting with these sort of smaller, more manageable projects, and how to identify what types of projects should be the first ones to engage with?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. So, basically the notion here, at least from my perspective, I won't speak for Roman, is that as with any other sort of large-scale initiative, large-scale, process and project, you don't want to take it all on at once, right? You want to sort of, kick the tires, get your feet wet, and so on. So, basically the one of the simplest ways to do that is to pick, essentially smaller, discrete, manageable projects. So in other words, if you're going to consume an open source project and work more directly with it, a lot of times you're going to start with something smaller, start with something that is, sort of well managed itself. Maybe as we talked about earlier, you're going to work with a commercial vendor, to sort of ease into that process to help them, or to have them help you, essentially work up to, the being a sort of full participant in a project. Or conversely, if you're going to start, releasing software of your own as open source software, you probably don't want to start with some huge, massive internal project. You start with something small. It could be a framework. It could be, essentially a small, library. It could be something, something relatively trivial even. But it basically, by releasing that, and by releasing something small that's easy for people to sort of look at, digest, become involved with, it keeps the experience manageable, sort of on the front end. So, yeah, basically starting with projects that are close to home, small, manageable is going to be your best route, to success, as opposed to, hey, I'm going to go, try to contribute and sort of, jump feet first into some huge, massive project with lots and lots of moving pieces and parties and, responsibilities and agendas and so on.
Yeah, also just being able to show quicker wins is something that can then build more confidence in the organization that this is something that we can take on and do. So that's, just from almost like a human psychology perspective, that certainly works. Roman, I was wondering if you could comment in light of that. Steve was talking about kind of smaller, more discrete projects. What about sort of newer projects, sort of things that are, more newly open source? What's the right way to think about how to target those as potentially good places or not good places to get involved as one of your earlier projects?
Well, I think, there are two classes of the projects that fit into sort of that category. I mean, on one hand, you've got all this innovation that's already happening in the open source community, sort of places like Incubator of Apache Software Foundation, or, some of the collaborative projects on the Linux Foundation side of things. So there's a tremendous amount of next generation stuff that is already cooking. And, an organization can actually look at it as essentially kind of like R&D, very advanced R&D opportunity, and just identify areas that are important, to the enterprise and try to sort of engage in those without really, productizing that right away, but just, trying to see how that can be beneficial to the enterprise, let's say, 5 years from now. So that's one. But on the other hand, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of innovation that is locked within the enterprise itself. So, people basically building systems that might not actually have any kind of, analog in the open source community. So picking up, smaller projects, I would agree with Steven absolutely there. And, figuring out if there is something, really cool and really non-trivial that you can bring to the table is a great way to jumpstart the community. And in fact, again, since I mentioned Apache Software Foundation Incubator, a lot of times I see new projects coming into the incubator precisely sort of from that perspective, right? Enterprises, realizing that they have this locked potential that is serving a particular need within the enterprise, but could be much more applicable to the broader audience, and they bring it into the open source community that way.
So, okay, this is, I think this brings together a lot of really great starting points. I've got a few, closing slides, and just want to give folks, because we want to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. So just a reminder for folks to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box. I had another, one more point here about also thinking about projects that matter. And, here this is kind of a quote from an executive at Capital One who, looking at their own business, identified, okay, something that's going to be really important. Hadoop is something that we're going to be used very strategically in our business, as it's a very information-based company. Arguably, all businesses could be described that way. And so that being something, that's another reason to focus on those types of projects that are something that matters. So Roman, you mentioned kind of also having something non-trivial to bring to the table in terms of what you contribute, but then also thinking about the projects being something that is non-trivial to your organization. So that's another interesting thought to add into the mix. And I think also kind of comes back to another point we were talking about earlier in terms of why open source for data, and how increasingly data being something that's so critical for fueling what drives the actual software that you build, and that the data being what ultimately differentiates your business. That data software is something that is should be part of that strategic type of software layer to focus on. So just given the time, I just want to quickly kind of close out. Here's a quick recap. And I think I'm going to be writing up some notes as well from this discussion to publish on the pivotal.io blog, but some that we already touched on in terms of, here are some action items, and, advocating open source to your leadership. To Stephen's point about really making sure you have that executive mandate and alignment in terms of, what is our position on open source, why is it important, and then making sure that everybody can kind of sing from the same songbook. And then, of course, if you are a leader yourself, the call here being, listen to your developers in terms of, why they probably have already been engaged with open source and why it's important to them. Assessing the projects that you have in use and identifying where to sort of pilot this process of starting to participate and contribute back and develop in more of an open source manner. And so that requires assessing what you have and using those criteria we talked about in terms of something that is probably smaller, a little bit more manageable, something where you have something non-trivial to contribute, and something that ultimately is a software that's worth investing in more deeply for your business, without necessarily being a software that in and of itself is a competitive differentiator. And then I liked Roman's idea of beginning the process of community building behind the firewall. These are sort of, I think of it as like you're learning to ride your bike with the training wheels on, and sort of doing that as something that's internal. Making open source engagement someone's job, and the notion of accountability as part of the cultural transformation that has to happen, a person and or group competency center, and we talked about some of the different elements that need to go into that competency center in terms of someone who kind of represents the legal side of things, and also can take responsibility for some of those agile development methodologies. And then finally, engaging in vendors and other third parties for guidance and collaboration, and that this doesn't all have to happen internally, and something that something inside the four walls of your company. You've got to completely take this on your own. That's something that you can reach out and get help with. So just to kind of my one or two slide plug a little bit for Pivotal and why this is so important for us, is certainly around from our big data suite and broadly across Pivotal. We are an open source vendor. My area of focus is our big data suite, which is a portfolio of open source data management software, including Pivotal Greenplum, Pivotal HDB, based on Apache Hawk, and Pivotal Gemfire, which we've open sourced as Apache Geode. Apache Hawk and Apache Geode are both incubating with the Apache Software Foundation. And this whole process of open sourcing is actually something that we announced just under a year ago, and in the matter of less than a year, we've open sourced 6 million lines of code into 4 new communities, including Greenplum and Apache Madlib, which is another project incubating with Apache. And we've also engaged with the ODPI, which is a kind of industry consortium for driving the adoption of Hadoop by creating some standards around what the Hadoop core includes, so that it simplifies the process for companies and their own roadmap building, software companies, and what they need to test and certify on top of it to really drive more advanced use cases around Hadoop. And then lastly is that we're now collaborating with around 250 open source developers across these 4 communities. So this is something that's been a major effort. Roman has been hugely instrumental in this process. So with that, we'll turn it over to some questions that we have just before we close out. One of which that often comes up, I see here, is certainly around why pay a vendor for open source software. And so Roman and Steve, if you want to chime in with some thoughts on that.
From my perspective, there are a number of different reasons you might want to pay a vendor. We've already talked about a couple of them. For example, if you want to sort of be more integrated into a community, a vendor that supports a given project, will help there. The most common, of course, is service and support. Particularly on as projects increase in size and complexity, it may or may not be your sort of your business, right, to sort of know and maintain a larger project. And therefore, you might want to sort of rely on people who, for whom it is their job, right? For that kind of service and support. Those are sort of common justifications. There are other reasons. Sort of legal indemnification can come into play. For some sort of areas of source code. But by and large, those are the most common in terms of service and support and integration into a community. There are organizations that may look to vendors to pre-integrate in a particular open source projects. So rather than sort of consume them piece by piece and do the integration themselves, instead they'll consume essentially a package sort of these projects. But there are any number of sort of different reasons and different permutations of the model, but those are the most common.
Yeah, I think, Stephen pretty much exhausted the list of reasons, so I'll try to, come up with, maybe one more. To me, an interesting angle sort of to look at vendor relationship is the fact that even though all of the open source software by definition is available for you to use for free, I mean, some of the integration work and sort of, I would say, productization work, especially for a particular vertical that vendor is doing, is actually still invaluable. So, I mean, the joke is that in Hadoop there is about, 3 different ways to do anything, right? So if you want to have, like, I don't know, HA, high availability, like there's a couple different ways to do that. It's great that the open source software is that flexible and that pluggable, but if you want to consume it as a platform, there has to be somebody who gets opinionated about, what sort of knobs need to be turned to what positions, so that that piece of software and adjacent pieces of software comprise the platform that the enterprise can consume as a product, as opposed to sort of, building this, Tower of Babel, from the Lego bricks. So the productization work is still very important, and a lot of times it does happen, at the vendor.
That's great. I think those are some really important points, and I think this is just something that can always be seen as an important part of just the process of evolving your participation with open source. So we've come up on our time, and I think the other questions here we can follow up as well. Mostly were sort of something that was already covered or that we kind of covered in this last question that was kind of a good umbrella question. So I want to thank Roman and Stephen for your time and everyone who was able to join today. I think this is a really useful discussion. Hopefully it brings some immediate value for you as you go back into your organizations and look for ways to make 2016 a time when you really turn a corner in terms of your participation with open source. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks.